I'm really glad that I got to go third and that the other two papers came first. These first two papers, we were talking about these large language models, and in particular these GPTs, and we kind of saw two implementations around both these promptings and the embeddings, really kind of the final products and the work in progress inventory within them, to see if they had any sort of signal or information that was not immediately impounded into prices, so it could help us to predict returns. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn instead to this AI, a little bit with language, but also AI in general, its ability to help us to predict behavior. Because look, financial markets aren't a thing. Firms aren't a thing. They're you. They're us, right? They're people and people's behavior, aggregations of those behavior, and game theoretic responses to those behavior. So that's really what I want to dig into with this paper. And I'm so glad that Alejandro presented this result where he said, look, there's this surprising result where it looks like there's far more positive news than negative news, right? He got on the order of like 150 to 20-25, right? A 6-to-1 ratio. Our paper could be one part of the explanation behind that. And in particular, this ability of financial agents to endogenously release information and to kind of shade what that information looks like. So the motivation for the paper is simple. And it's just that targets are a thing, right? They're used throughout society. And we can think about these in finance, but they're used all over, right? Things like sales targets, growth targets, exercise targets. They're all examples of how we use these throughout our lives. And they're made in order for us to have some kind of verifiable ex-ante metric that we can easily compare ex post realizations against. Now look, they can be fixed, right? I can say, gosh, our sales revenue target, 100 mil. That's what we want to hit. They can be floating. We want to be above the 75th percentile in our industry, if that's what we're shooting for. And when a firm has one that's externally imposed, then there's no scope for strategic behavior because we have some outside source that's both imposing and then verifying it. However, relatively less attention has been paid to firms' abilities to move targets themselves. So when they can internally and endogenously both choose and then re-choose those targets, then if agents don't understand that, the agents who are consuming this, so us, financial markets, then we're going to see some really interesting things that can happen with that and with investor responses. And so we're going to show in particular that firms do exploit their ability to do this within the universe of publicly traded firms. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to use the universe of conference calls, earnings conference calls made by firms over this 15-year period. And we're going to look at how they do this, when they do this, and what the outcomes of their moving of these targets are. And we are going to see that on average, like was mentioned, this predicts negative realization. So what we're going to see is that firms have targets, they set targets, they keep those targets until they can no longer hit those targets. Okay? And then they subtly move these targets. So I'm going to give you some examples of exactly this. The first one I'm going to give you is research in motion. Research in motion. It's also known as BlackBerry Limited. So this was founded in Canada by Mike Lazaridis and Doug Freegan. And at the time, they were both engineering students. And the way that they started was they were tech developers. In fact, they were one of the first wireless tech developers in North America, but they're better known for a BlackBerry. And I have to ask you this, okay? In this room, and again, this is closed. It's a closed room, like Chris mentioned, so there's no shame here. How many of you had a BlackBerry? How many had a BlackBerry? There we go. There we go. Remember the little trackball, that little trackball you used? God, I still remember that finally. And so look, it was not a thing. So to all the youngsters out there, PhD students, everyone else, this was not a thing, it was the thing. Okay? It was almost a verb, BlackBerrying someone, right? Like it was that big. It was that ubiquitous of a thing. Now, it essentially died when the iPhone 4 came out. It was already a little bit on its way out, but the iPhone 4 killed it. So what was the iPhone 4? That was the first phone that had a front-facing camera. And so that brought about FaceTime and all these other things, and BlackBerry just couldn't keep up. So what did we see them doing? Well, in December 2010, Up until that point, they had consistently touted their handheld device sales as a key metric of performance. Okay? And it's clear why, right? It really dominated what they did. In fact, for 18 quarters, for over 4 years, 4.5 years leading up to then, they had mentioned handheld device revenues first thing in their call. Okay? They would start their call and they would talk about handheld device revenues. That changed. That changed in this quarter in 2010. So let me show you what that looks like. Here are those earnings conference calls. And in the beginning, it was Dennis Kavelman, okay, for these first 3 quarters. Then it changed to Brian Badolka. And Brian Badolka, every time, not only mentioned handheld devices right at the beginning of his presentations in these earnings conference calls, that's what's in highlight, he even talked about them the same way, okay, almost using the exact same phrasing in every quarter leading up to December 2010, and then out of the blue, just stopped talking about them. Okay? So you can see this is these first, they're talking about this is the fiscal years, this is the first conference call since 2006. They didn't mention handheld devices at all. Okay? Now, what happened to their price, and this is just an example of research in motion following that, well, it was exactly this. Okay? This is that first quarter that they didn't mention these handheld device revenues anymore, and you can see we see this drop in their stock price. And then what happened in the news, and I'll show you a little bit more about this, and I'll show you this is ubiquitous throughout publicly traded firms, but they started to mention why, and it was the drop in these handheld revenues. Clearly, they were no longer competitive with Apple and then all these other competitors that came out, and that spelled the end of research in motion. Okay? And this is kind of, you can see this in terms of revenues, so there are a lot of different little sources of revenue here. The big blue bars are the handheld device revenue. And so you can see it peaks, and then from there, this precipitous drop. Okay, it's not just, like I mentioned, not just BlackBerry that's doing it. Here's another example of the firm that killed it, Apple, doing the same thing. So this is a news announcement that came out where Apple decided that they were going to stop reporting iPhone numbers once the growth went to 0, right? They said, gosh, it's no longer about iPhone numbers because they no longer were hitting these exorbitant targets that they once had been. But it's not just them. It's McDonald's, it's Adobe. One of my favorite is Netflix. So Reed Hastings used to come on, and analysts just used to be so excited to hear how many more people were signing up for Netflix. First, it was subscribers in the US, and then they expanded internationally, and everyone would come on and just be waiting for Reed Hastings to talk about subscribers. Finally comes on and says, everyone, I want you to know, it's no longer about subscribers, it's minutes watched. And from then on, just talked about minutes watched. Why? Because everyone in the world is a Netflix guy, right? I mean, at some point, unless he's going to get aliens or something, right? We have all the subscriber growth you can get, and so had to move that target. And that's what he did. And that's what we see happening, again, across these firms, and it has return implications. So what do we do in the paper? Well, I'll give you our main findings, and I'll jump into some of the tables and hand it off to my discussant. So we find that this, what kind of BlackBerry did in Apple, this is ubiquitous across the universe of firms throughout the sample period. And even we see it happening a little bit more at the end. What's kind of neat about this behavior, I'll mention this already, this is not a firm doing this over and over. In some sense, it almost can't, right? Because it's got to establish its target first. What we find is that firms find this optimal to do at some point in their lives, and then you won't see them doing it again for another 3 years or 4 years. So in that sense, we get a good portfolio turnover. Every quarter, it seems to be some other firm that is finding this optimal to move these targets. How do we do this? Well, we employ natural language processing techniques to analyze these conference calls and to really both identify the targets and the movement of those targets. And like we mentioned, when they change that, that predicts significant negative returns and real effects. I'll talk about what some of those real effects are for that firm in question. In particular, on average, these firms underperform by about 78 basis points per month in value-weighted returns over this kind of coming quarter period. And so I'll show you exactly how we get that. And again, we'll dig into what's driving it in places where it's even a little bit larger. The returns tend to be larger when a more complex set of targets is being used. That kind of makes sense. Moreover, they're larger for non-financial targets as opposed to financial targets that might be easier to tack onto and to understand. We find that they become even stronger when it's a more ingrained target at the firm. So in those cases, kind of like the research in motion, the BlackBerry, where it's been 16 quarters, then that jumps to about 100 basis points per month in valuated returns. Now, what's kind of neat is that we find that if analysts do pin the CEOs on this, so for instance, if when they stop talking about handheld devices, if the analyst says, no, you're not going to get out that easy, we want to hear about it. And they question, and the CEO finally talks about it, we find that that attenuates this result, which is to say it drops by about half. So that predictability drops by half, presumably, because then they're ferreting out that information. That's investors, that's the market kind of understanding what's going on and really pushing the CEO in that kind of game theoretic response sense. And so kind of stepping back, investors, we think, should pay close attention, especially to these endogenous metrics that firms have more flexibility and these subtle behaviors that we can now pick up in language that we use here, but language models in a different way, right? We're not using 500 billion parameters here. No, instead, we're looking at what Reed Hastings does or what Mike Lazaridis does and how they're speaking relative to what they've done before, and especially when they're speaking about these important value drivers at their firms. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, like I said, we use these natural language processing techniques. In particular, we use this Spacey package, which is a Python package, to essentially that, along with a name entity recognizer, we use that to try and extract these targets from the conference calls themselves. And so to demonstrate how we do this, I'll give you this Apple call. So here's an example, an excerpt from that conference call. This was by the VP, their VP of Finance, Peter Oppenheimer, in a 2009 call. So in particular, we pull out products, we pull out money, and so these are usually in dollar terms, but in any currency terms, and also percentages. The percentages help us to look at increases and decreases. The products themselves, again, from that name entity recognizer, in this case, would be Mac, MacBook, and Snow Leopard. And then we can tie these percentages back. And this is where the trickier part is, tying the percentages back to the individual, in this case products, but entity that they're talking about. And so that's where we have to kind of play out this model where we have to go forward within sentences or even multiple sentences to try and tie back the individual numbers and percentages to the entities we're talking about. Okay, and so here you can see we're talking about this $1.6 billion is referring back to net income. Okay, and so once doing that, once we can tie back these percentages to the targets themselves, then we have our set of targets and can kind of compare those targets within firm over time. And again, this is all a within firm over time comparison. Here's an example, again, for Apple using this. You can see that the iPhone, this is the rise and fall is talking about here of the iPod. So the iPod was also a thing until there was an iPhone. Okay, and you can see that here. It actually peaked at about 40% of Apple's revenues were driven by the iPod. And you can see that early in our sample at those top word clouds, you'll see iPod and iPhone together, it disappears. Okay, after about 2011, the iPod is no longer mentioned at all within these calls, and it's dropped completely as a target. Okay, so let's take a look at what these portfolios look like. So in the paper, what we then do is just sort firms by this simple measure. Now that we have target changers, you can think about those most intense changers and the firms that don't change their targets, the non-changers, we can see the future returns to these firms. And that's exactly what we're showing here. We have equal weighted and value weighted portfolios here. And you can see both in excess returns, and it really doesn't matter what factor model we use, we see this spread in returns. Okay, here, that long-short quintile portfolio has value-weighted returns of about 55 basis points. And what is so interesting to us about this is, again, that it does not seem to be driven by the factors, that it's stronger in value weight And you can kind of see, like I talked about before, that we see this in these extreme portfolios. So that's that number I mentioned to you before, that 78 basis points per month. And these firms do not look like very small firms, okay? These are some of the larger firms like BlackBerry, like Apple, that are finding it optimal to use this. And you can kind of see this in that the value weight returns here are actually larger than these equal weight returns when we look at them. Here are the portfolio characteristics of these firms, just so you can see that these changers and non-changers do not look all that different. So the changers are these Q5s here. And so on average, they're even a little bit larger. So these are not firms that are very hard to short or will have any T-cost kind of implementation worry when we think about what might be driving in terms of any limit to arbitrage. It doesn't look the place where our classical limit to arbitrage would really bind as an explanation. We then take a look in Fama-McBeth framework just to try to control for other return determinants. We say, gosh, what if this is driven by standardized unexpected earnings or some of these other return to short-term reversals? And so we run this model. You can see in that kind of top line is the moving targets, our moving targets variable. It's really unaffected by these other return determinants. So it's not that we're picking up something with these moving targets that is somehow related to all these other known return determinants in this kind of predictability sense. And I want to end just kind of comparing some of these cross-sectionally, what I talked about before, and then where we're going from here. Okay? So we talked about highly persistent versus low persistent targets. It turns out that this is significantly more concentrated. You can kind of see that in the top rows coefficient, significantly more targeted in the more persistent targets. Think of that like research in motion. And that makes sense in that, gosh, if it has been a target that has been established for so long, then they're only going to move it when nothing they can do can kind of allow them to keep moving that target. And it may have bigger value implications, exactly what we find here in returns. This, again, is also significantly larger when the set of targets that they're changing is more complex. So if they change one that's super easy to track, then it kind of makes sense. The market will figure that out. But when they're more complex targets, so when they're both longer and trickier to figure out within the call, then we find it to be larger. And lastly, we find it stronger for targets that aren't financial. Financial targets are a little bit easier to track because you can hone right in on them, as opposed to more of these kind of complex textual targets. And so this kind of last result we have is not on the targets themselves, but when the analysts push the CEO to talk about it. And I think this is something we want to explore more, because this is that kind of game theoretic response in real time we see of investors pushing on those targets and realizing they're important. And what we find here is that when investors do that, it makes a difference. And so these returns are cut by roughly half. You can see that 0.032 versus about 62 in that first column when analysts push the CEO and force them to talk about it in the call, okay, when the CEO actually has to respond. And so the event time returns to this. So this is a graph just plotting the event time returns. That blue line is the return to that long portfolio, okay? And the orange line are the changers. These are the BlackBerries, right? These are the Apples, the ones that change, and that's the long portfolio. And what you can see is that these returns do not exhibit any type of reversal even 2 years out. So this does not seem like information that's an overreaction but is then reversed in prices. Instead, this is something that investors should be taking into account, are missing, and eventually is impounded into prices. We've run a lot of robustness on these just to make sure that this is not some kind of aberration in the data. And like we said, it doesn't seem to be concentrated in any given industry. There's no factors that we see that are driving this. And it's strong up through the present day. In fact, even a little stronger recently. And one participant actually just came to me while we were eating and said that they were implementing this not only in the US, but also in international markets. And so it looks good in international markets too. And I said, can I get a fruit basket or anything, my friend? Come on, my man. But anyway, so that was good to hear. It was interesting that it holds in international markets too. So look, stepping back, and then I'll go to our to-dos, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our discussant and from you, from your comments and suggestions. we show that firms consistently exploit this ability to strategically shift the targets that they both set and then reset. We employ natural language processing techniques to extract these targets and moving of these targets. When managers change them, that predicts negative realizations at the firm going forward, negative returns, when the managers feel the need to move that target. Consistent with that mechanism, we find the results are significantly stronger for more complex, non-financial, and the most persistent targets that they have. Stepping back, given how often targets are used, not only at the firm level, but we can think about other agents in financial markets, things like policymakers, central banks. Understanding that subtle ability to move targets is going to be important for interpreting any information they're giving us. As we get more technological advancements that allow us to both collect and process this type of information like we saw today, we think that's going to just move this game theoretic equilibrium even further down the line. And so we think this probably applies to lots of different information environments and information documents that firms have. So things like bond covenants, lease arrangements, M&A prospectuses, interviews, investor presentations, I think they're all rich places to kind of go and look for this exact kind of endogenous target setting and then resetting by firms and financial agents. We have more that we want to do when we started to explore these. I think we can do more, and we started to explore more around the missing targets measure itself. Things like net changes in targets, waiting to find the most important target, like that handheld revenue, and more manageable versus less manageable targets by firms. I think that's fascinating to look into. We have, like I mentioned before, some evidence on real effects. It does predict future earnings misses, right? And we see that with those negative returns. Future analyst revisions downward. It also predicts future bankruptcy, although they're low frequency there. And then searching more about contemporaneous response and looking at the correlation with other firms' strategic behavior, I think are all going to be great channels to look into further. And so with that, I want to thank you again for your attention, and I really look forward to your comments and suggestions. Thanks so much.
Super excited to discuss this paper of Lauren's. For anyone that is familiar with his work, you'll know that he's basically one of the titans in this area and has really brought us our understanding forward of some of these frictions. And so, as Lauren kind of highlighted, this is a little funky. One of the sort of the main questions of the paper is basically, how do investors or how does the market react to changes in the particular performance measures that are chosen by firms? And I think that this is a super important question for a variety of reasons. One of them is just that every single firm is kind of different in their own unique way. And so by allowing firms to pick and choose the measures that they present, to a certain extent, we enable them to provide something that is the most relevant and useful for valuing the firm to the investors. But at the same time, it's costly to process information, and so if every single firm is presenting a different metric, then all of a sudden, it becomes difficult to context switch between firms. And then the one that's at the end here, kind of mandatory disclosure, is a little more near and dear to my heart. So anyone who's followed the SEC's climate disclosure rules and the pushback on that, there are actually some kind of First Amendment challenges to the SEC actually being able to compel firms to disclose certain ESG metrics and things like that. And so I think that this paper can speak to if regulators can't actually step in and provide a framework, do investors have the ability to both compel and interpret the information that firms are providing in this space when the regulator themselves doesn't have the ability to do it? And so I'm just going to quickly breeze through the approach because Lauren did a great job of highlighting everything for us. But basically, the authors, they assembled two different databases of earnings call transcripts to build this nice time series from 2006 through 2020. And then they're going to identify targets using something called named entity recognition, or NER, and dependency parsing. And so for folks who aren't familiar with this, named entity recognition, the idea is that particular words belong to specific high-level concepts like products, percentages, dates, money, things like that. And so the authors apply NER to text Whenever they see a product, they say, okay, that's a target. Let's keep track of that. And then as Lauren mentioned, whenever there are money or percent entities, it's a little bit trickier. They have to do some dependency parsing where they see a percentage, they follow the link back to the verb that's talking about the percentage, and then follow that back to the noun that's associated with it. And that becomes the target. So in this case, sales would be a target. After they've identified all of the targets over time, they assemble a very straightforward and easy to understand measure of moving targets, which is basically just what targets were mentioned last year, how many of those were mentioned this year. So if I completely change up all of my targets and I don't reuse anything from the prior quarter, this is going to be 100% or 1. And then if I reuse all of them, it's going to be 0. So what are the key takeaways? The things that jumped out at me anyways when I was looking at this is that firms talk about targets a lot. So I've never sat on an earnings conference call and tracked every single time someone mentions a target, but on average, they mention over 126 of them. So that was kind of surprising to me. I think that's, to Lauren's point about behavioral finance, that's an awful lot of targets to keep in your mind as you're listening to a conference call. And then also, they seem to move targets pretty frequently. So, on average, they drop more than 55% of the targets that they were using the year prior. So I think there's a lot of turnover, and it speaks to the fact that it's going to be difficult to track these things over time. A big takeaway here is that basically the most frequent movers, they underperform the market, and then the least frequent ones seem to overperform. The authors find that this is a little more pronounced when the firm's targets are more complex, or intuitively, if it's a more qualitative metric, it's less non-financial based, then it's harder to interpret as well. And so in the author's own words, basically their evidence is consistent with investors failing to realize or take into account the valuable information in these simple changes in targets. If you read that and you're like, that sounds really familiar, where have I heard it before? Well, these are the authors of the famous Lazy Prices paper, which I don't know what it was like to get it published, but you guys first posted it in 2010, right? So I think you brought us all around to this way of thinking, which is great, but it seems like it took a while and took a lot of work. And basically they highlight that even simple changes in 10Ks and 10Qs from quarter over quarter, investors seem to struggle to identify those because there's just so much stuff they have to sort through. And so discussing this paper is kind of a tall task for me, but I'm going to do my best to do it justice. And so my first thought when I was reading the paper is that there's an awful lot of literature on targets, particularly in compensation contracts and things of that nature. And it made me wonder, how does that interact with what the managers are saying? So if a manager has sales in their compensation contract, and sales are no longer growing, are they going to drop it, or do they anticipate that investors are very, very likely to ask them about sales because that's how they're compensating the manager? So I think it would be interesting to maybe dig a little bit more into that. Another thing is that a discontinuation of a target, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So when Apple stops discussing the iPod, maybe it's just because the iPhone has a greater TAM than the iPod. And so discontinuing it or stopping mentioning the iPod is actually a good signal. So I think maybe there's some work that could be done there with the NLP to sort of sort out whether or not discontinuation of the target is a good or a bad thing. And then I also was wondering, is there more to the story behind what's driving the alpha? So if we look at, the kind of event time returns, the alpha is also coming from these least frequent movers. And that's not just in the event time plots. We see that a good chunk of it also comes through in the tables. And so to me, it seems like the paper could also be about moving and stationary targets. Maybe Lauren's plan is to get 2 JF pubs out of this paper, though, instead of just one. So, I was just curious to see whether or not there was something that could be done there to dig into these stationary targets. And then lastly, I'm a big NLP guy. So naturally, I was wondering, is there something that you could do to develop the measure further? Right now, I kind of like how straightforward and parsimonious it is relative to people just taking an LLM and using it as a hammer and hitting stuff with it. But nonetheless, this is the day and age that we live in. And the statistical-based parsers that this paper is largely based on, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this stuff is basically developed at Penn back in 1999. So go Penn. But a lot of stuff has evolved since then. And I think there's some things that we could do to improve it. So NER, it's known to be a pretty challenging task. If we look at the example that the authors have in the paper, we have a bunch of product entities like Macs, Snow Leopard, MacBooks, and stuff like that. But there's also stuff that's being missed. So iPhones is right there. I think there's a Mac one somewhere, Mac products that's not being captured. So these models aren't perfect. And if these are just noisy errors, then we can forget about it. But to Lauren's point, this is sort of an adversarial environment where the managers are endogenously choosing what to mention, how to mention it, and things like that. So if they anticipate the methods that are going to be used to analyze their speech, then maybe they're going to speak in a way that induces errors in the model. I don't know. So I think that's something we should think about. And just to sort of highlight this, we typically think of the performance of a classifier using precision and recall. I always try to show these as graphics because they're hard to think about, but the idea behind precision is if you have, basically you have a certain number of items that are being retrieved. So let's say we have 100 items that we label as products, and only 60 of them are truly products, then our precision would be 60%. At the same time, if we have 100 products and we're only able to truly identify 60 of them, then our recall would be 60%. And so these are the statistics that we usually use to evaluate these type of models. The current state of the art is this model called Luke. It's a transformer-based thing. It's one of these big LLM type models. And it has about a 20 to 40% improvement over Spacey, depending on how you measure it. That said, we can improve that more by doing some fine-tuning that I'll talk about in a second. And so a shameless plug of my own research, I have a paper with one of my students at Chicago where we actually take all of the content on Edgar, not just 10Ks and 10Qs and 8Ks, but literally everything. We extract it into a nice clean form that's ready for training. And we extract about 150 billion tokens after deduplication. For reference, GPT-3 was trained on about 300 billion tokens. So this is almost enough to train a pretty serious LLM like GPT-3. And I think Brian mentioned common crawl-based data sets in his presentation. Less than 0.1% of the data in this Edgar scrape that we did is actually in Common Crawl and other web-based data sets. So for anyone who's tried to access stuff on Edgar, it's pretty difficult. So that content seems to be buried. And the LLMs are probably not trained on it. And we find that the content is systematically different than what the LLMs typically are trained on. So there's an opportunity to incorporate business text, I think, into these models. And in our paper, we show fine-tuning the LLMs on this data improves performance on financial tasks. And so in that vein, the paper that I'm citing here for the performance statistics, they fine-tuned Spacey on their own domain-specific data set, and then they found that it crushed Luke. So maybe there's something you could do where you take some of the Edgar data, do some fine-tuning for the specific products and stuff you're interested in, and then you don't have to do the crazy transformer stuff, but you have this really nice parsimonious model. So domain-specific models. On the more practical side here, I was also sort of wondering, what is it like to actually live with this strategy? So I actually manage my family's own money, and we don't ever take overnight risk. We trade intraday, so I'm sort of laughing at some of the questions that have come up here, and we do it all via retail. Thankfully, Citadel gives us some nice price improvement. But I have run these sort of regressions, and I have statistically significant alpha, but I also know what that means to actually live through it. It's not like I just experience 99 basis points every single day flat line, up and to the right like we like. There's variation there. And so if we just sort of work backwards from the t-stat, because I don't have the data, it looks like the standard deviation of the alpha is about 281 bips. So there is some volatility there. And if we think about what that's going to be like to live with, this is only 36 OBS. I think maybe you guys have like 150 something in your portfolio tests. But we're going to have good months. We're going to have bad months. At the end of 36 months, maybe we're up 20%. It's not the perfect up and to the right graph that we would hope. And then also if there's autocorrelation of returns, a lot of this stuff is earnings, seasonality. We know that when one firm reports earnings, oftentimes it's correlated with what's happening at other firms in the industry. So if there is some sort of autocorrelation there, then that could have a big impact on what it's like to live with the strategy as well. So from a practical standpoint, maybe these things would be cool to look into. Scalability. So just sort of trying to work backwards from some of the descriptive statistics. They have like 143,000 conference calls. There's about 156 portfolio months. So that's about 918 events in a given month. If we think about assembling the portfolio, we're going to split everything into 10 deciles. We're going to use 2 of those deciles, and then we're going to hold it for 3 months. So that means that on average, the portfolio has maybe 550 stocks, which speaks to what Lauren was talking about with it being a pretty well-diversified portfolio of a lot of liquid stuff. And then if we think about how much we could scale it, it's basically what's the average number of firms times the size of the firm times the average daily volume and the participation rate that we want to be at. So if we take a pretty modest participation rate of maybe 10% of average daily volume, then you could scale this thing to 88 billion. And so even if there's some transaction costs and stuff like that, and it's not really 99 bips, it's 50 bips or whatever, like this seems pretty scalable, which is pretty awesome. So maybe that would be another thing to add to the paper. So yeah, in conclusion, they come up with a really nice parsimonious measure of moving targets using some classical NLP methods. They show that the investors don't really seem to be pricing this information or taking it into account. And for me, I really like the paper, but maybe there's some opportunities to connect it back to the compensation literature, explore those least frequent movers, and then some more sort of just practicalities of implementing the portfolio. So thank you very much.
Bradford, thank you. Lauren, would you like to respond? And
fantastic. Yes, yeah,
questions?
please. Well, thank you so much, Bradford.
Yeah,
this is
cheers.
absolutely fantastic. And I have to say, Bradford, I always love wonderful discussions, very well thought out discussions like that. It leaves me wondering whether I should make you a co-author, or in this case, I should have you managing the Cohen fortune. But I'll tell you this, with 6 little ones at home, it's mostly IOUs, okay, and pennies. So that'll be about all we have. But thank you so much. This is absolutely fantastic. We'll absolutely look into those more. They were great. And I'd love to open it up for questions and comments from everyone else. That'd be great. Please.
That was great. Maybe more of a philosophical question, but I've heard some of the criticism of these kind of like earnings transcript or management call NLP models is that they work really well in the past, but management's going to figure out that you wrote this great paper about moving targets, and so IR is going to come to them and say, hey, we got to change our behavior. Do you think that that's a concern, that people are going to figure this out and that in the future there's not going to be that kind of return premium there?
Yeah, and so look, I think that's broadly a great question. It may surprise you that my following from Fortune 500 CEOs on the Instagram account is not huge. So I'm not sure how many of them are going to be reading this. Look, you could be right. In equilibrium, we could see that in a year, 2 years, 3 years. I'll tell you this. What's kind of interesting in the data that we've seen so far, and again, we don't have a huge amount of data, so I don't want to overplay this, but it's certainly when we split it into halves, in the second half of our sample, there have been more of an ability for investors to do this kind of thing, right? And to parse earnings calls a little more clearly and quickly and to do these kinds of analysis. It's actually larger in the second half of the sample. And so that's at least some suggestive evidence, but we'll see what happens. It's a great point and great question. Thanks. Yeah, please.
Question on the analyst interaction results that we've had. It's a little counterintuitive when the analysts are poking the CEO that the pounds gap closes. Is that because of perhaps a biased ranking of analysts that can ask itself. Let's say, you have 5 analysts ask a question, all of them are bullish. They kind of ask it in a right tone. I mean, is there some kind of spin doctrine? I mean, I'm just saying that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. No, I love it. So I have some other work. You have the exact right intuition. So I have a paper called Casting Conference Calls. And so it turns out managers on average do exactly this, that they let in the analysts who are super nice to them. And if you ask a really jerky question, the best example from that is then Amazon to a Seattle-based analyst. He asked such a hard question that they changed their number. They gave him the wrong number, and he was calling like a Pizza Hut or something. I mean, they really pushed this guy out, which I thought was wonderful.
I was blocked on a lot of calls.
Were you blocked on a lot of calls? Well, congratulations. That's a great badge of honor. And so I think something like that could be going. Now, I want to say specifically with that result, what we find is that future predictability is down. And I think part of that reason, and we have a little bit of measure of this, but I want to do a systematic study of this first, is that just more of it is realized at the earnings call itself. So the analyst pushes the CEO to say right there that, we missed our target. And then you see return realization here. Probably in net, it's the same. So think about it like 30 and then another 30 instead of all 60 coming at the next point. Yeah. Thanks so much. That's great. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Extremely interesting. I'm glad, in some sense, not LLM based. Did you think about, you mentioned robustness a little bit, any, let's say, quantitative signals for when it will drop off, when the target will drop off an earnings call, like flattening, for instance, of the target, right? Which is one, in one of the examples that you mentioned, that tends towards 0%, the growth, for example, and then, signals like that could explain in advance whether they're about to drop off, and maybe part of the underlying mechanism.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. We haven't thought about that at all. It's trying to predict when the targets will drop. We'll take a look into it. It's a really good suggestion. If we can see from a quantitative sense that going down, or even the way they're talking about it, maybe how much time the CEO is spending on the given target. Like Bradford mentioned, they spend longer on some targets. So if we see it start to shrink, we can kind of predict them dropping it off. Yeah, that's a great. Thank you. Yeah, please.
Did you do any adjustments for monoline type of companies versus multi-product line companies? So that the target or the metric for a company that only has really one dominant product could be much more interesting than when it has multiple products.
Yeah, we haven't done that, but that would be great, right? Like Goodyear, where are they going to hide, right? Like we do tires, and we have tires, and also tires. Yeah. It's a great suggestion. Yeah, we haven't, but we'll look into that.
So, and Bradford mentioned this, I guess. Does it interact with, low cosine similarity filing firms, hearkening back to your lazy prices work?
Yes, yeah. And so we have looked into that. And so it turns out it doesn't. So this is much more dynamic in this kind of earnings sense of them talking about these. And so it really is separate from that. It's separate from SUS and all these other measures of other types of things they might be doing. But yeah, it's a great question. Yes?
How do you define complexity? Complexity of...
the targets, the target set? Yeah, and so there we define it with the number of moderating words they have around the target itself. And so it's words and around the moderating words itself as opposed to just reporting a number.
Words around the target?
Yes, words around the target. So just describing words around the target, yeah. Perfect, yeah, please.
Yeah, so this kind of made me a broader question when it comes to natural language models and whatnot. But all throughout the day, we saw how these words are translated to numbers and then back again. Is there anything that you might have heard of that kind of tries to capture the tone, like raised voices, profanity, anything like that would help indicate that we get these kind of things, or like I don't want to be asked that question?
Yeah, and so I haven't seen anything on that yet. And so there's an earnings measurement. So there's some work out of Duke where they look at the tone of the managers and what they're saying, but they haven't interacted it with the words or the targets or anything along those lines. I think it would be fascinating to look at. And earnings calls are definitely the place to look because you'll hear in some of these earnings calls, I mean, these are just fun to read. You have some of these managers will they'll say, oh, I'm going to get you the next time I see you, analyst A. And they're even say like awful things like, oh, you should go jump off a cliff and you should do that. They get really upset. And, what? Yeah, Elon, yeah, surprisingly does that almost every call. And so yeah, people just expect it. But it's remarkable how hot that they will get in these, which just shows the ability of analysts and just this game theoretic, what a neat environment it is, whereas kind of gladiators have to go against each other. They can't pull away from these things. But yeah, it's definitely something that we haven't looked at. And we can look into a little bit more because these are all recorded at this point. So it'll be cool to look into. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the questions.
Lauren, thank you. Bradford, thank you so much. And thank you for the kind words as well, Lauren. That means a lot.